Okay, everybody, thank you for joining. We'll be going live very shortly. Thank you for your patience. That's great. So we're live, folks. We'll just wait for our chairman to arrive. We also have Dr. Narongchai joining. That's great. So we were just finishing up the opening remarks given to us by Laura Lane and by Dr. Tantri Datuk Rebecca Maria from the APEC Secretariat, which are wonderful to hear what the conclusions for them were from APEC and from COP27. Fantastic to get first-hand knowledge from those who have participated. So I'm just going to check we have our chairman here. To webinar, here we go, in the backstage, coming on stage now. Here we go. There we go. So, Mr. Chairman, Andrew Weir, welcome to the plenary session 1 of the Pacific Basin Economic Council Dialogue Summit for 2022. And I'm delighted to see the panelists have been able to figure out and joining this wonderful platform. We're streaming live, both online and in LinkedIn. So we welcome everybody who's watching us from afar, from around the region, and those who could join the room directly. Thank you so much. So Andrew Weir, Chairman, I would like to hand you over to the chair and keep to time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Michael. And I've just moved from one chat room hosting, welcoming everybody, into a new one, and it's worked seamlessly. So thank you very much, Michael. And a very, very warm welcome to our friends on the panel today. We really have a very esteemed panel. The session is APEC and G20 updates, new dimensions on connectivity in the Asia-Pacific, sustainable economic priorities. And as I said earlier, it's very much what it says on the tin. Connectivity is one of the priorities. Interconnectivity is one of the priorities just referred to by Laura in respect of APEC 2023. And of course, sustainable economic priorities underpin everything that has been happening at APEC and G20. And I'm very honored today. Maybe I could just very briefly run through our fantastic speakers who are well known to you. We have Dr. Narongchai Akrasanee, who spoke last year. Has been a fantastic host of Thailand, and you must be feeling very satisfied, I think, and very energized after the remarkable chairing Thailand has done at APEC this year. We have Matt Murray, the US senior official for APEC in the US Department of State. We have Stephen Jacobi, fresh from speaking last year, former executive director 2021 of APEC and the RCEP Business Council, and of course hosted so much for us at ABAC in New Zealand earlier this year. And of course, Suzanne Puanani Vares-Lum, the president of the East-West Center, and of course, a former major general in the US Army, calling in from Honolulu. We're very honored to have you, Suzanne. And Andrew Weir, the Director of Public Affairs, APEC, and lead on regional development, Southeast Asia for Google, calling in from Australia. Thank you, Andrew. And of course, Fung, Managing Partner at Saltagen Ventures and ABAC Canada representative based in Hong Kong. What a wonderful panel we have today. And over the next hour and a half, we look forward to getting some real insights. Maybe just to set a bit of scene. It only seems like yesterday when we had COP26 in Glasgow and APEC 21 in New Zealand. Yet it does feel a long time away, doesn't it? Much has changed in 2022 under the APEC 22 Thailand's chairmanship of APEC, G20 Indonesia, of course, and the ASEAN, Cambodia, and Egypt's ASEAN, Cambodia, and Egypt's COP27. Whilst the global economic outlook is tenuous at best, and politics and markets in transition, we've had the COVID pandemic, we have the Russian-Ukraine war, and we have the increasing frequency of climate calamities, and of course, the demon of inflation and cost of energy. Also the challenges of food security. The current political and economic uncertainties do raise significant questions about the future course of action that both businesses and governments should be undertaking. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement has come into place, and Indo-Pacific is a concept which has been raised much more in the last year. RCEP became operational from the 1st of January 2022, a massive scale trade arrangement. The data from the first quarter of 2022 shows that China trade with member countries expanded 7% year on year to be 2.86 trillion renminbi, which is about $450 billion US. RCEP, of course, allows China to further leverage its trade potential and secure greater market access in the region. However, of course, this is all part of a geopolitical framework. And in many ways, and in many parts of the world, there's an increasing inward and protectionist focus. And there's a big focus on domestic policies and also, of course, national debt levels and national policies. So all in all, it's a bit of a melting pot, and there are very many mixed signals out there. And this session will explore projections and conjecture of what lies ahead in the region's economies and how to navigate through this increasingly challenging geopolitical landscape. So what I've asked is for each speaker to share their reflections for 5-6 minutes on their area of expertise and their reflections on this concept of APEC and G20 updates, dimensions for connectivity in Asia Pacific, and sustainable economic priorities. And maybe I could ask Dr. Narongchai to kick off first. And once again, thank you for a wonderful chairing of APEC 2022 in Thailand.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. You say talking on the area of my interest. My interest is international economics and international politics, which is very wide. We have heard summary of APEC 2022 from Rebecca. Fantastic summary. We have heard the pledge from Laura about this set-asiding politics. Both of them excellent presentation. To me, what was last week was a stage show. ASEAN being the stage. We had a show beginning in Cambodia, Bali, and Bangkok, and very interesting. Cambodia is like an introduction, and the star there was Joe Biden. Then you move to Bali, and then the star would be Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. Finally, in Bangkok, the star was just Xi Jinping and nobody else, with supporting actors coming from France and Saudi Arabia. So it was a fantastic finale. Now, to me, what happened last week, the achievement last week was less political tension among major powers. We all know the subjects. No need to learn about the subjects. So the achievement was less political tension. And I think that is the most important matter, important issue confronting us today. Why do we have the political tension? All of us know this. Economic reason, we have had imbalances of benefits from trade and investment. 2010, 2020, real imbalance, some perceived imbalance. Technology, we have had digital technology rivalry, particularly between US and China. Politics, we have democracy against autocracy. Accusation here, accusation there, some real and some perceived. And finally, geography. You may call it revenge of geography, boundary and area disputes. So all this have created what we call trust deficit. I call trust deficit. That was the main reason. And without meeting in person, for something like 2 years among all the leaders, the trust deficit developed themselves, creating all kinds of problems. Effects of this trust deficit that we have seen, supply chain disruption. For example, US, instead of buying cheap things from China, now started to buy from Europe, much more expensive. No longer driven by market, now more driven by politics. We have digital supremacy rivalry. Who to control the chips, the major chips? Where would the chip come from? Localization of chip making, not buying chip from the best producer like Taiwan, for example, or China. We have limited cooperation on climate changes. Despite all these pledges, and pledge of cooperation, very limited. And on top of that, the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years, we have had COVID-19 pandemic, causing more quantitative, QE, the production of QE, or I call it production of money. That's the real cause of inflation we have today. Fantastic inflation. And as if that was not enough, we had the Russia-Ukraine conflict starting from this year, February. And that caused the energy market, confusion in the energy market. These are the things of what I call the trust deficit, causing political tension and causing, making all the economic problems that we have had more severe. So if all these meetings, if we could reduce this political tension, it would be to the benefit of all of us. So if you look at the meetings that we had, ASEAN, G20, APEC, they are all highlighting the same priorities. Highlighting priorities and cooperation on climate changes and on BCG model. Because these things, nobody can say anything bad about it. It's like motherhood, You cannot say mother is bad. All agree. It's easy to have agreement on these things. But we need real economic model to make it work. I am an economist. I'm still looking for one. I'm suggesting this subject, the sustainability theory of value. If Alfred Marshall could produce one model, we should be able to produce another model, an economic model that make these things work. Otherwise, just pledges and promise and not met. But this meeting highlighting the cooperation. So that's number one. Second, the pledging of cooperation to help solve other issues. The ones I have mentioned before. It's a long list of issues that they pledge to solve, to help solve. It's the same list, the same pledge. But with less political tension, maybe this is more realistic. And the fact that they have introduced this investigate or study of the FTAP again, we introduced the subject, we meaning myself and my friends in the academia. We introduced the subject in the early 1970s, 40 years ago. So I'm happy that they see important significance of this subject again, even though it's after 40 years. I don't mind. We can go back again. Plus all other issues that they pledge to cooperate. That's fine. But let me conclude by saying what I see in 2023. I see the new modus operandi of supply chain. No way that we could turn back this modus operandi of localization of major intermediate products like chips, like onshoring, like friendshoring. It will continue to be there, which affects trade flow. So the first one. Second, I see the reconfiguration of energy market. With Russia having to want to sell to other places, with Europe having to buy from other places. Even Thailand is now importing natural gas from US. How silly would that be? How long that would take to come here? But this is the new energy market. I see high inflation, high interest rate. With all the money, supply of money, printed, came out during the last few years, that would keep interest rate and inflation high. Finally, I see reconfiguration of financial market. The financial market will not be the same as before. There will definitely reconfiguration. So the global economy, as a student of internal economics, I would like to see it more market-driven, but now it's becoming more politics-driven. I am only hoping that this political factor is not so important or so serious that would really distort all the market forces or market factors. I see the meeting that we had last week, very helpful, hoping that that would delay the so-called political intervention into marketplaces, which would allow market to function, would allow resources to be allocated optimally, be good for everybody in the world. This is what I'm seeing. Thank you very much.
Narongchai, thank you. An absolutely excellent run through. A great explanation. I think you're absolutely right on imbalance of benefits, perception imbalance of benefits, trust deficit, question mark, and the need for real economic models and more market driven. Narongchai, just a couple of questions before we move on. I think that the first one is, what has been the reaction in Thailand to APEC 2022? And what are your hopes, given the excellent chairmanship in this last year, the hopes for APEC 2023? So we got a bit of a problem on hearing you, Narongchai.
I'm speaking.
That's better. That's better. Yes,
okay.
We can hear. Thank you.
So I'm saying that Thai people, they're very good at organizing parties. So to the general public, this is like a festival for them. They're very proud of what they have been able to do.
Yeah.
They're very happy to see some of the leaders visiting many places. Macron was a superstar. Xi Jinping was a senior statesman. He's the most senior statesman. Highly respected, well received, and he was looking very good. He was feeling very good. So that was very good for the world. And Macron softened everything, And then we have this prince from Saudi Arabia. He was also a very prominent. And the fact that Thailand was able to invite Macron and MBS from Saudi Arabia to join APEC meeting, that had made APEC much more relevant, to a lot of people. Then you have Kamala, the vice president from the US. She was very, very nice lady, and visiting many, many places. I think if Biden was here, it would be some tension. I'm glad that he was not here. So in general, the Thai people received that very well, very good. Of course, there was some demonstration about, from the people questioning the value of APEC, but that's common. Everywhere we had APEC meeting, there was some demonstration here and there. Not a big group, but the treatment of these people was a little bit too severe. So to answer your question, there was some comment about how the authority, how the security people treated the demonstrators. That was the only negative part. Apart from that, it was a fantastic week for Thailand.
Good. That's good. Thank you very much, Narongchai. And I look forward to you going to the US next year and a very good transition. We look forward to it, Narongchai. Thank you. Matt, Mr. Matt Murray was delighted you've joined us, and at some unearthly hour from the States, Matt. Thank you very, very much for making a time. Matt is the US senior official for APAC at the US Department of State. And Matt, thank you very much for joining us today. Matt, when you think back to APEC and G20 and think of these dimensions of connectivity in Asia Pacific, sustainable economic priorities, what are your reflections, Matt, and what would you like to share with us today?
Sure, great. Well, thank you. And first of all, really appreciate the opportunity to be able to join you. Hope you can hear me okay.
We can hear you perfectly, Matt. Thank you.
Yeah, just got back from Thailand, and it was a really terrific APEC Economic Leaders Week and a really terrific APEC year. Completely agree with the previous speaker. Thailand did a brilliant job of hosting. They just did, in all aspects. I mean, not only did they throw a great party and cover all the logistics, but they also did a great job of advancing a really positive policy agenda. Particularly the launch of the biocircular green economy. And we were really pleased to be able to support the Bangkok goals in the biocircular green economy, which will really emphasize sustainability in APEC in a really much more comprehensive way than before, which will be exciting for us to continue in our own U.S. host year that's coming up. And I think that, look, it's all the more impressive what Thailand was able to accomplish given all the challenges they were facing. At the beginning of their host year, still very much in the thick of the COVID pandemic, Thailand advanced a lot of different priorities on returning to travel and tourism across the region, which was really key. We had to have our first senior officials meeting in February virtually because of the Omicron outbreak across the region. And so to consider that, and then on top of that, shortly thereafter, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, creating a lot of economic hardship around the region in a number of different ways, which then also created some complications with getting to consensus statements in many of the ministerial meetings. And of course, APEC really prides itself on consensus, and so that was a challenge. And then, of course, some of the economic challenges we all felt in the downturn that many parts of the region experienced this year. So I think Thailand deserves a lot of credit. It was a difficult year. It's hard to believe, but this was our first in-person APEC Economic Leaders Week since 2018. So a lot of this was getting back to the muscle memory of really having APEC. And of course, we learned a lot of lessons that we want to apply for next year. But I think my key takeaway from last week is that APEC, as well as the G20 and many of these other forums, they really are, particularly when we get back to in-person, they're really outstanding conveners of our leaders, our ministers, our senior officials, to be able to really get together and try to work on solving problems together. And I think when we look at a lot of the economic challenges we're facing, that's really going to have to be our priority going forward. And I think that it was really amazing to see the way the G20 was able to reach a consensus leaders declaration, which I then think put a lot of pressure on us in APEC to do the same, despite the challenges with the Russia-Ukraine invasion and the economic impacts that it had, and some of the differing views on that and how to handle that in the APEC context. So I think all in all, really successful week last week. It was amazing to have the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the U.S. Trade Representative, and a number of other senior folks in Bangkok, as well as a terrific delegation on the private sector side at the CEO Summit, also our APEC Business Advisory Council delegation. And so, really, all in all, a very successful week. And I think now we take the baton. That was a big part of the week as well. We will be in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I see our good colleague Suzanne on the screen, and we'll be at the East-West Center December 7 to 9 for the informal senior officials meeting, which kicks off our host year. And then we'll be taking that next year to Palm Springs, Detroit, Seattle, and then, as the Vice President announced last week, our Leaders Week will be in San Francisco. So our theme for next year will be creating a resilient and sustainable future for all. And then across, just as Thailand had the priorities across open, connect, and balance, we hope to be able to, our priorities are planning to be interconnected, innovative, and inclusive. And we will be taking forward, many of the APEC work streams under those three areas. And I think, as Thailand demonstrated, sustainability will be a huge focus for us. We want to do what we can to build on the biocircular green economy. The Vice President talked about this, everything, looking at renewing energy targets in APEC, looking at the just energy transition that the US government has been working with partners on, and really seeing what we can do to advance our clean energy objectives around the region. I think sustainability and climate objectives have become really key for all of our partners. And so we want to continue to really emphasize that piece of the policy agenda. And then inclusivity, again, I mean, if you look back to our 2011 host year, where the leaders meeting took place in Honolulu, it really was very focused on women's economic empowerment. It launched that whole stream of work. And what we've seen, what the data tells us, is that when women are able to fully participate in economies around the region, there's economic growth that results from that directly. And so, we want to continue to work on that, but also broader inclusivity, underrepresented groups, looking at, the whole range of, different groups of people who feel like they may be disenfranchised by the global economy and the regional economy. And so what can we do to lift up those groups across our country, but also across the region? So I guess I would just close by saying, it was a great year in Thailand. We're really, looking forward to hosting next year, the APEC meetings. And, certainly we see it as, you mentioned the G20, we wanted all to plug in together so that we can be constructive as we, really look to multilateralism as a solution to a lot of issues and a lot of problems, and work with like-minded partners and allies around the region of all shapes and sizes to try to, really solve problems as we move forward. Thank you.
Matt, it's a great run through, and your commitment, literally recovering from a few hours sleep, having gone back from Thailand, speaks volumes. Matt, just a couple of reflections on what you said. Your last point in particular, multilateral engagement. In this part of the world, as you know, there's a lot of noise in the system about geopolitics from different angles. Sometimes it's a China-US relationship, now it's China in the region, it's EU or intra-region. Can you just expand a bit on the philosophy of the US State Department with regard to multilateralism and the noise in the system one hears of retreating into national priorities, nationalism as a global trend? What's your take on that?
Yeah, a few things. I mean, I was really fortunate in 2021. I happened to be in Washington when the new administration came in, and I heard it straight from Secretary Blinken, straight from Deputy Secretary Sherman, and our whole leadership in the State Department, how critical it would be to be, getting back into multilateralism and really trying to solve problems in these organizations together. And I was very privileged to be able to travel with Secretary Blinken in October of 2021 to the OECD ministerial in Paris, where I really got a, kind of a very visual cue into what his vision was there, which, really is about getting our, partners and allies and groups together from these different, economies from around the, the global economy together to try to really work on addressing problems together. And I think that, in APEC, it was a challenging year, and there's no question. I mean, there are challenges whenever you are, in part of an organization that includes not only the United States and China and Russia, but also 7 ASEAN members, Japan, Republic of Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea. I mean, we all have very different views. You're there in Hong Kong, Hong Kong, China as an economy, and APEC has different views. And so working through that together, it is a challenge, but I will tell you this, that the fact that we were able to get 3 consensus statements last week, a consensus leader statement, a consensus ministerial statement, and the consensus on the Bangkok goals for biocircular green economy, I would just say that doesn't happen if the United States and the other economies that are part of that organization, if we're not committed to multilateralism. Because it would have been very easy through those negotiations to go off the rails at some point.
It's a very good last point there, Matt. Thank you, and I think it is recognised, and I think greatly appreciated this renewed commitment to multilateralism. As you say, Secretary Blinken is definitely leading very much that charge, and I think the onus is on all of us. Particularly an organization like PBEC, to embrace those governments which are trying to basically foster the right environment for the development of trade and all of the key priorities you run through. So Matt, thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And I'd like to move on to Stephen Jacobi. Stephen gave a wonderful run through last time we had our dialogues about the priorities in New Zealand, and also later about the outcomes from APEC in New Zealand. And Stephen, you must have been very interesting having a look at the recent APEC and G20 updates. And What's your take now on the next steps on connectivity in the Asia-Pacific region? And I know you're very passionate about these sustainable economic priorities. Again, you're sharing on that.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and kia ora koutou katoa to everyone, because I am from New Zealand. Sawadee krap, because I've just spent all of last week in Bangkok, and namaskar, because I'm here in New Delhi at the moment and speaking to you from the residence of the New Zealand High Commissioner.
You were truly multilingual, Stephen, aren't you?
Well, I'm trying to spread the good news around the world.
Good for you. Good for you.
But look, you know, I guess the principal observation I have is that, well, firstly, I'm really glad we're not doing APEC virtually again, having been through that in 2021. But the world is coming together to solve the world's problems. I mean, this builds on Matt's very good points about multilateralism and about Dr. Narongchai's points earlier. You know, this is what we need to see, whether it's at COP27, at G20 or APEC. The world, the solutions to these serious problems that the world faces can only be found by the world working together, however, you know, imperfect it seems at times. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of months has been truly excellent. I agree with Dr. Narongchai that President Macron was a real star at APEC. I mean, you know, somewhat surprisingly so, for a French president to come and tell us, as he did, that it is unwise for the world to enter into competing blocks, and what we need is a global order. He got a massive round of applause on that from at the APEC CEO summit, and I think it's absolutely right. We have to approach these issues as a world community. These are very tough times, very tough times. I must admit, I did wonder whether the prevailing, you know, excitement at APEC kind of you know, didn't quite do justice to the difficult mess we are in at the moment. A very toxic mix of pandemic and war and inflation that is having terrible consequences, and very difficult for New Zealand companies, might I say, doing business around the world. And yes, that trust deficit is very, very high. ABAC has been advising leaders and ministers and senior officials this year that there really has to be action on two levels. One level around the immediate challenges that we face, which are mostly to be solved by economic instruments to deal with inflation and an urgent need for accelerating structural reform, and then to go on to those big medium to long-term issues that still bedevil us, a need for a more seamless environment for trade, action to address the climate crisis, steps to broaden economic inclusion, and you know, concrete moves to expand the benefits of the digital economy. All of those things were in the mix. And I thought that you know, our Thai hosts in APEC this year, and I agree with Matt, have done an extremely good job of bringing a lot of this work together. And just two things from the outcomes in Bangkok that I'd like to highlight. Obviously, the Bangkok goals of, you know, biocircular and green economy. At last now, we have a sort of a blueprint for discussing environmental challenges, and I think climate challenges in particular. Last year, ABAC and under New Zealand's leadership adopted a set of principles for climate leadership. We can see a lot of connections there and are very keen to work on that. And the other one is this refreshed conversation on the free trade area of the Asia Pacific. You know, success has 1,000 fathers, Dr. Narongchai. I know that you were very much involved in these early days, and ABAC itself in 2004 came out with the idea in its recommendations to leaders, which just goes to show you that good ideas do take a long time to put into place. But we think that concept still has relevance. We've described it as a journey as well as a destination. You know, I don't know where this train is going, this FTAAP train, but we certainly need to jump on it. And we can do so through the pathway agreements, CPTPP, RCEP, and also I would suggest IPEF. I'm not sure that IPEF is seen quite in that context, but certainly from a New Zealand business perspective, it's pointing in the same direction, and we need to bring all of these instruments together at some point. just perhaps to conclude, I would say that, now, and I'm sure Laura mentioned this a moment ago, now is really the time for business to stand up. We have to articulate to political leaders what has to happen to improve the global economic environment. We have a great opportunity to do that during the US hosting year. I was certainly there for the last one, and where the motto of ABAC USA was "Get stuff done." So the US is extremely capable of getting stuff done, and we're very much looking forward to working with the United States on these issues and keeping alive that broader goal that we are all in this region together, and that inclusion means bringing in those groups that are left outside, and indeed those whole economies that need to form part of the solution to these very, very challenging times. So kia ora, Andrew, and thank you again for being part of this excellent conversation.
Well, Stephen, thank you for your excellent comments. Stephen, you're very experienced in this space, in the run-up to New Zealand hosting, when the transition from New Zealand to Thailand, and then of course Thailand now transitioning to US. Your sense, and then a very interesting comment you made about, well, possibly amidst the party and the rallying calls, the complexity of some of the issues possibly may not have been embraced. Maybe just expand on it, and what progress you think APEC's been making in recent years, and the progress made in Thailand, and on those knotty issues, maybe just you could expand a bit, which you think maybe we need to do a bit more.
Yes, thank you.
Are we heading in the right? It's a great point, destination and journey. But are we moving forward enough? And is the destination good enough?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, just on the current economic conjuncture, I mean, the outlooks for a growth next year are not good. The IMF has got some fairly sober words about that. And, I heard the comment actually in Bangkok, if it isn't actually a recession, it certainly feels like one.
Yeah.
And, we may find that it takes us longer to get out of this situation than we are in. Look, I mean, I'm always a glass half full sort of person. You have to be if you actually are interested in trade and come from New Zealand at the bottom of the world. So, we're all optimists as well as hobbits down there. I mean, I think it is fair to say that APEC in recent years, whether it's under Malaysia or New Zealand or Thailand, is grappling with much bigger systemic issues than maybe we have in the past, and a much broader set of issues. ABAC and APEC for the longest time was really a trade shop, and that was the mood of the times, the growing spread of FTAs, the big mega regionals, all those sorts of things. But we are now coping, or addressing rather, the cross-cutting issues of the age around climate, around inclusion, and around digital. These are the big topics. They're not ones that can be solved in any one year. They have to go from year to year. And I think that the adoption of the Putrajaya vision under the Malaysians' year, the Aotearoa Action Agenda under New Zealand's year, the Bangkok goals in Thailand's year, all of these things are leading us to make a much more coordinated response, notwithstanding all the geopolitical tensions, which make it really, really hard, but at least brings us all together in some way, shape, or form. And it's only the skill of diplomats like Matt that can work it all out. But I think that's a positive sign. Not so positive, of course, is the fact that we are not dealing with these issues at the speed with which they are themselves evolving. You only have to take the climate crisis, which is not primarily an APEC matter. Obviously the big solutions are being found in COP, but APEC can do a lot in that space. And in some respects, we're coming very late to the party. And it depends on a lot of political will and a lot of, involvement of individual governments to do the right thing. that's going to get us there. So, and APEC's voluntary and non-binding nature needs to be brought up again. It's its greatest weakness as well as its greatest strength. Its greatest strength because people can be free and open to discuss and try new things and all that sort of stuff. Its greatest weakness is that when push comes to shove, you have to look to another forum to make absolute, concrete, verifiable progress. But, if we didn't have it, we'd have to invent it. So long may it continue. And I think it would be helpful if APEC got in a bit earlier in the year, in the meeting cycle, I think. But anyway, it's there and we need to make the most of it. And lastly, and sorry, I'm going on at length, but business has a voice at this table in a way it doesn't have in the other, instruments. And we have got to make everything with that. And I'm very confident in our friends, Dominic Ng and Laura Lane in ABAC USA to help us move in that direction. Kia ora.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a very good run through. In fact, what you're saying about, a couple of reflections. I think there has been a step change in APEC and ABAC since starting with Malaysia, and then the continuum. It's been more core economies hosting, which I think has been very, very helpful. And I've seen a step change in that. Secondly, your point about these big issues, I think the corollary with business is very clear. I don't think any major business or any major national economy doesn't recognize the mega trends of our time, doesn't recognize the importance of purpose, the importance of digitalization, the importance of ESG, social inclusion. The challenge, as you say, is the pace. And our economies and companies being, at the cutting edge of reform, cutting edge of change, driving, leading, are they laggards or somewhere in the middle? But the pace, and of course, the pace of change is often determined by the economics as well. So the direction of travel, I think, is clear, but the speed is probably going to be variable and is different in different sectors, different kinds, and at different points of time. But I think it's a very good point. Sorry, if I just be greedy, Stephen. FTAAP, you spoke about this last year, which is basically a free trade area for Asia Pacific. Is it fair to say it's still quite nebulous, Stephen? Still quite early days, but the economic potential is obviously massive. What's your take on it at the moment?
Well, I think the concept has evolved quite a lot between the early 70s and the early 2000s, when we were talking about really an FTA, a super FTA, or the idea that everybody would negotiate together. I think these days that's probably not feasible. Then we had the idea of maybe we could have these pathways, CPTPP, RCEP, and others that could somehow merge. I'm not so sure even at the moment how that one might work either. So now we are looking at, the idea I like is the one that's encapsulated in the Putrajaya vision, which is an Asia Pacific community. It's actually very similar, Dr. Narongchai, to what ASEAN is doing through the ASEAN economic community. But the idea of a community which is characterized by, well, we used to call it free trade. Now we might call it different things, fair trade, I don't know, rules-based trade, at least a seamless framework for doing business, where it's as easy to do business in one part of that community as it is in another. That is where we are moving to, I think. That's the destination. The journey is about putting the building blocks in place. And that is going to be, yes, those mega regionals, yes, other instruments that are underway and evolving. We've got IPEF, we've got DEPA, we've got a whole lot of digital agreements. Andrew can probably talk a lot more about them. But, all of those things brought together. And what we really need to make sure we have really is some sort of overarching structure. And I think this refreshed conversation on FTAP that Thailand has led has been a really useful addition. We've got a multi-year work agenda now, which we can continue to work on. So keep the faith, Andrew. That's the main thing.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. And I think you're right. RCEP, I don't think would characterize itself in any way as a pathway now. It's an end in itself. But this concept has to be one we keep pushing. And Mike, maybe this is something in our white papers from the dialogues we can help Stephen and Thailand, which again has reopened this discussion on FTAAP. So Dr. Narongchai, Matt, Stephen, thank you very much so far. We now move on to Suzanne, who's the president of the East-West Center, and has a wonderful role as president of East-West Center. Of course, was very senior in the US Army, but being based in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is originally where PBEC, of course, Suzanne was based in the very early days before its secretariat relocated over to Hong Kong. I don't know, maybe 25 years ago now. But Suzanne, you know, you're uniquely positioned, hearing all this geographically, and also, I suppose, as your organization. What's your take on APEC and the G20 recent meetings? And again, the dimensions of connectivity in Asia Pacific, Suzanne.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew. And it's great to see you, Matt, and wonderful to meet you all and our distinguished panelists. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. And again, happy to talk about that connection as well of the Pacific Basin Economic Council because of our geography. And of course, being the crossroads of the Pacific here in Honolulu and having been the host to APEC 2011, you know, it was a lot of buzz here in Hawaii. You know, the East-West Center's work focuses on what I think Dr. Narongchai said, the trust deficit. That really resonated with me. And just hearing, you know, the need for the world coming together clearly in all of these dialogues, that is really the core of the East-West Center. This idea of realizing new dimensions of connectivity is really the core of the mission. And for those who are not familiar, you may be, Andrew, and some of you on the line on the East-West Center's founding, but really in 1960 and a little bit before that, a lot of our founders, Eisenhower signed the authorization of the establishment of the East-West Center after the ushering of then Senator Lyndon Johnson, then becoming President Lyndon Johnson, and our late Senator Daniel K. Inouye, and our Congress, believing that and investing in a place where East and West could come together. And of course, the E is both ways. That's not a Chinese character. It's E facing both ways, depending on your perspective. And that we would have a long-term investment, sort of like stocks. I'm investing in young leaders today so that tomorrow, 10 years from now, 25 years from now, we can make a 5-minute phone call that took 25 years to develop. But that's sort of that trust deficit. If you don't invest in it now, you will not have it later. And you can just look at the 68,000 alumni since 1960 who've come through this center. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants who have gone on to their countries to make, you know, significant change. Pulitzer Prize winners, Nobel laureates who've come through here, heads of state, economic leaders who've come through the East-West Center, primarily during those golden years, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So, you know, our founders knew that this center's mission, which remains today, there needed to be a place that promotes better relations and understanding among people and nations. And while this is a U.S. institution, you could apply it anywhere. U.S., Asia, and the Pacific through cooperative study, research, and dialogue. So many of them through our long-term programs that have their master's and PhD in a lot. And we used to have the Economics Institute here that would drive a lot of decision-making through the research and having, of course, dialogues. And just as Matt had mentioned, we're very excited about having the informal meeting here for APEC in December. I wanted to share a few things that we have gone through, just kind of assessing the environment, much like you saw at the G20 and APEC, is that, you know, we believe here at the East-West Center that the changing environment has a direct impact, of course, as was mentioned, on the economy. You know, environmental mismanagement, such as overfishing in our waters, pollution, deforestation, are exacerbating food and water insecurity, heightened vulnerability to natural disasters, forced migration, and conflict. These in turn decrease, of course, the social and economic resilience. And as people and communities grapple with the diminished livelihoods, education, and health, And as environmental degradation and climate change grow ever more severe, of course, our region faces the worst impacts, which really was discussed in many of these forums. And the second challenge that we've identified here that we believe the East-West Center can approach and other like organizations is a need for good governance. We're seeing, of course, just as Matt mentioned, the not including 50% of any population is really a detriment to any economy, but also a challenge to really lively and open and free governance. You know, many of the world's population now living in autocracies, societies across Asia and the Pacific facing those challenges of resource scarcity, internal conflict, and outside pressures that, of course, are causing destabilization that in turn affect the economy. And I would even say, you know, we have a student here from one of the Pacific Island nations that is challenged with gender-based violence and causing internal instability, and her mentioning how that is really challenging economic investment in that country because people are not willing to put forth their treasure into a place where the future is unknown. But a lot of it stems from the exclusion and threat of women as part of a total society. And that, along with other marginalized groups, is really challenging good decision-making, creating gaps, larger gaps between the haves and have-nots and good leadership. And the third theme that we look at, again, there's a spotlight on the Pacific. Pacific Islands region, of course, is increasingly on the front line of the two biggest risks confronting the entire world: accelerating climate change and, of course, intensifying geopolitical rivalry. So sustainable development in the face of environmental degradation and disasters really is the greatest challenge in the Pacific. And they have mentioned that is their #1 existential threat. So looking at these challenges, you know, while we here at the East-West Center develop these pillars, I think they are what has been mentioned across, you know, APEC dialogues as well as G20, is that we need to really invest in the next generation of leaders as well. Developing and equipping leaders, not as just as individuals, but a network, an active network that understands, is innovative. So we talked about innovative solutions. I've heard that from several of you, but really it starts by raising those voices of the next generation of leaders, allowing them to be culturally and technically competent in a time when I believe that there may be a tendency to want to look inward rather than outward. I think the role in which these forums can play is really bringing in that next generation, not just established leaders. The second pillar at the East-West Center we have is convening these impactful dialogues, just as you all have, but overlaying that integration of bringing in those next generation of leaders. That is sort of the secret sauce of the East-West Center that I think could be modeled elsewhere. The third area or pillar that we have is partnering with Pacific Islands. So we, again, this past year, if you look at many of the things we've done, I think the role that developed nations and economies can play in the Pacific, I think, is key. And the fourth area, of course, is fostering environmental solutions. We have been supporting a lot of research and connectivity to community-based solutions in the region. And the last area, of course, is supporting good governance to improve, you know, of course, our leader development through open and free press, and as well as women's entrepreneurship. And that's one of the areas that we're working on as well. So I just wanted to share that while I'm not an economic expert, it's great to be here amongst you to talk about the educational and leadership investment and component that I think is key. Again, going back to developing that trust deficit and filling that gap. So thanks so much.
Suzanne, thank you. Thank you so much. And you raised a couple of themes which we haven't touched on yet, but I think we'll be carrying on throughout the conference. This inclusivity, next generation empowerment of leaders, development of new leaders. I think, and Lester Huang, who is another vice chairman of PBEC, is very passionate about youth. And I think we all need to recognize that this bringing through the next generation to see the benefit of organizations about like the East-West Center, like PBEC, like APAC, getting young people engaged in it, as you said, not falling into a very myopic, very national or very introverted way of thinking is very important. And I think you make important points on social infrastructure, and particularly education. And again, Mike, I think when we look at our dialogues as part of our output of this event, I think we need to make sure that these aspects are properly explored. Suzanne, a wonderful run through of the history to East-West Center. You very humbly say you're on the shoulders of giants. I'm sure you're a giant yourself. How would you answer the question that geopolitics is overshadowing everything at the moment in the region? Sorry, is geopolitics overshadowing everything in the region, or is it almost two streams where you have a geopolitical narrative, but a few rungs below that geopolitical narrative, there's a lot of pragmatism and collaboration and a lot of opportunities still to work together? What would your take be?
Andrew, great question. I think you're absolutely right. You know, if we use the example of our dialogues in the Pacific alone, you know, the White House Pacific Dialogue, our Pacific Island Conference of Leaders that we just had here at the East-West Center, the heads of nations within the Pacific region have all said that understanding that the geopolitical strategic competition is happening and it's overlaying, but there, just as you said, there are some very practical things. You know, after coming out of COVID, the number one concern, in addition to climate change, is sustainable economies, being able to feed, educate, provide healthcare for the people. And in order to do that, you've got to have the economic engine that allows you to do that. The gaps that have been outlined have not a lot to do with that strategic competition. Many of them have said that they see it as a U.S. PRC piece. Yeah. And really, many of the leaders are looking at their own responsibilities of taking care of the people and how they're going to do that. And they'd like options, they'd like support, and they would like to partner in very positive ways. So it's very practical. It goes down to the very human level. And I think I'm glad you bring up that question, because we tend to want to talk up here when there are some real issues and challenges that we need to address that all of us can help. And opportunities for us to partner and have the hard conversations that need to be had.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you. And obviously, I'm based in Hong Kong and spent a lot of time in China. I see that very much, where there's been a lot of very practical conversations of all major economies regarding business with China, including vice premier level from China, trying to develop it at that level, whilst knowing at that level there's an umbrella of geopolitical tension. So I think it's very important one keeps a sense of perspective, and there are areas of possibility and win-win and working together, probably sometimes in a piecemeal way, but it is very important we don't have this overshadow of negativity, which can cause paralysis. So thank you very much, Suzanne, and great to have you, and welcome to your new role. We now move on to, thank you, Suzanne, thank you. Now move on to Andrew Weir, who's the Director of Public Affairs at Asia Pacific and lead on regional development in Southeast Asia for Google. I think Andrew's well known to many of us. And Andrew, I think when you reflect on APEC and G20 and your very senior and important role in an important geography for a major tech giant, with, I suppose, a lot of skin in the game on all these discussions and a lot of contribution, I think, probably to make to this playing field. What would your reflection be on connectivity in Asia Pacific and the sustainable economic priorities?
Thanks so much, Andrew, and thanks also for a great panel. It's a really great discussion already. To answer that question, I think the lens through which we see this is always going to be our mission, which is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. And to do that, it relies on being part of a much bigger ecosystem, and one that is supported by an open and secure internet. And so I'd like to kind of unpick those 2 points a little bit in the conversation and then touch a bit on some of the other topics at the end. But it's worth, I think, also just, I mean, it's an obvious point, but I think useful to remind ourselves of the central role this region is playing right now in the global policy conversation, both with the G20 this year in Indonesia and of course APEC in Thailand, and also next year looking to the G7 in Japan, the G20 in India, and APEC being hosted, I think, in obviously, you know, the largest economy and bringing more prevalence there. So I think that from the policy conversations that weighting here, including on the technology, digital issues are in this region, but also on the commercial side, that's weighted as well towards this region. Over half the world's internet users are in this region, a third of the world's unicorns, a third of the world's software engineering base. It's the global leader in e-commerce, the global leader in online gaming. So I think, you know, we have here a strong voice in this region that I think we can exercise. And I think that is particularly important when you think about these two concepts of an open internet and a secure internet. And on that first point, you know, the internet from our perspectives has driven or been part of helping to drive big improvements in living standards around the world, from improving access to skills and education, helping small businesses get online. And my favorite stat in that regard comes from the Asia-Pacific MSME Trade Coalition, which found that the internet drove a reduction in the cost of exporting of 78% for small businesses. So it's not marginal, it's transformative. And I think those gains, which are kind of by their nature, productivity enhancing, deflationary in nature, those gains are threatened when you start to impose constraints and complexities around data flows. And so that's the reason we really see the importance of an open internet, one that, you know, even this webinar itself is relying on data flowing across boundaries, and virtually everything you do online, whether it's sending an email or purchasing a good, relies on the same thing. So for that reason, as governments start to think a bit about new rules governing data transferred abroad, it's important to find frameworks and mechanisms that protect privacy and also allow for that data to flow as the underpinning for essentially the digitization of the economy. And I think APEC played a great role here in the origination of the cross-border privacy rules now adopted globally. And we were delighted as a company to announce our intention to certify with that earlier this year. On the secure side, that's rising in prominence, I think. In this year, we've seen kind of a widespread and alarming increase in cyber attacks around the world on public institutions, on companies, on governments, on individuals. And that's brought, I think, into focus a decades-old problem and brought it more into the policy conversation. And the war in Ukraine, I think, has offered, I think, a glimpse of a full-scale war in cyberspace and underlined the importance, I think, of governments, companies, individuals working together to protect citizens from those online threats. We've done a lot of work in that space to try to both, of course, for ourselves, but also work with others to drive education and better awareness among that. Governments have, of course, long been used to thinking about these issues, but the challenge is becoming more complex. Individuals are the access points for most cyber attacks through phishing and malware and other approaches. And so the need is strong for that awareness to be built more broadly. So I'll kind of leave that piece there, except I think that's an important part of the conversation. And just touching, I really like that the way Matt framed all the themes for the US host year around interconnectedness, innovation, and inclusion. And I guess the points I've just made relate particularly to interconnectedness, but I think there's a very strong role here also for technology in innovation, and in particular in addressing some of the points we've been discussing around sustainable development and climate. And as a former climate negotiator, I always have seen the strong role I think technology can play in driving efficiency into the economy and mitigation through that mechanism, particularly with the growth of AI. And also on inclusion. And as a company, we've trained over 50 million people in digital skills in this region over the last decade, and we'll continue to invest very heavily in that space. And just to end, I suppose my favorite moment actually in Bangkok last week was, for those of you who know the APEC App Challenge, which brings together a group of young developers from the 21 economies to work on apps that are in support of host year priorities. The alumni from that operation, which has been running sort of 5 years or so, came together and wanted to do something themselves for Thailand, and which we were very happy to support. And so they launched an initiative called Let's Code Thailand, which aims to educate 1,000 people in rural Thailand who otherwise would not have access to coding to start to learn to code and bridge that gap, because I think that inclusiveness gap is a really critical one for this as we move forward. So I'll sort of end on that note. I touched a bit on the interconnectedness. I think the other 2 points are really critical as well, and we're looking forward to playing a constructive role in that next year.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much. And as you say, your day job links in very, very well to those priorities which are being discussed. And I think you articulate really well the positive power of technology. I think it's very easy to talk about digitalization technology at sort of 60,000 feet, and that it's important on connectivity. But it's very, very interesting, that point you raise about how internet and digitalization reduce the cost of trade. I think this is a really important one. And again, I think, Mike, that can be something we do reflect on. And it, you know, this technology and technological development and the openness of data flows has a massive economic impact. And I think that's something PBEC's voice should be out on, because, you know, we are the respected independent voice of trade. And I think articulating truly how technology and digitalization can help, I think is very, very valuable. Very interesting, Andrew, what you say about training on coding and everything. Again, your take on Suzanne's point about education and earlier points as well about next generation, young people. What more needs to be done in that area, do you think? Or what good things are happening which could be leveraged even more?
Sure. No, it's a great question. I think it's really critical. And often when we think about digital infrastructure, we, you know, in terms of ensuring economies are fit for the modern age, we think about physical infrastructure and physical capital. But I think the human capital is equally important. And I think that digitalization for many economies in the region has been kind of come at a faster pace than expected due to COVID. And I think there's several economies that essentially really had an accelerated digitalization and are probably kind of scrambling a bit to be ready for it. That's partly on the physical capital side, but on the human capital side, that's absolutely critical as well. I think there's no point having the best connectivity in the world if people aren't able to use it or certainly not maximizing it. And there's a lot of, I think, low-hanging fruit in terms of leveraging the human capital that exists in this, and in particularly in economies, dynamic young economies in which we operate, in terms of harnessing that ambition, those ideas in ways that can be leapfrogged. And as a small business owner, that's the opportunity. And actually the app challenge in Papua New Guinea in that host year, I think, was really about creating an app to help handicraft weavers who would normally have to go through multiple middlemen to get to market, access directly a market, and then attach information around the provenance of their handicrafts, which would, you know, increase the value of the good ultimately being sold, that people could identify who made it. So the technology can play this leapfrog role. And I think there's a huge kind of dividend that can be reaped there from investing in human capital. It's a huge lift. It's a huge lift. But I think that it's also a huge return in terms of an economic boon from unleashing the ambition and the skills of folks in region who can really have an outsized impact if they're able to drive that interconnectedness.
Yeah, well said, Andrew. I mean, I know there's very mixed signals, as I said at the beginning, out in the global economy, but a recurring theme is, notwithstanding these mixed signals, most economies and most companies are actually experiencing shortage of access to the right quality of labor for their roles. And I think this goes to the human capital element. The technology element is so much more important than a few years ago. And I think I would turn it around that if we don't challenge enough on that human capital development, the next generation development, and the democratization of technology, availability of technology, we're going to struggle greatly. So thank you very much for that, Andrew. I'm afraid Joseph is not able to join us today, but he has got a very good reason. He is actually meeting one of the prime ministers in the region as we speak. So I think that's a perfectly acceptable reason for Joseph not to join us today. If I could just pick up on a couple of things I think it'd be interesting to get the panel's view on. There's no shortage of acronyms in the trade space. And there's two acronyms I'd just like to pick people's brains on if I can be a bit greedy. The two are RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and reflections on how you think this is going, where it can go next, what it can lead to, because the scale of it is incredible. It's a third of the world's economies somehow involved in that, obviously dominated by the Chinese economy, but also ASEAN, very important part of it, as we know. And the second one is IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement, which I think a couple of years ago, this concept had been possibly put on the back burner, or maybe it was not up in lights as much as before. Where's that heading and what can it mean? Maybe I could ask Dr. Narongchai for your reflections on those two areas first.
Yes, the most important issue is about what you include in the trade agreement. If you include basically commodities, merchandise, it's easy. It's easy to agree to, like ASEAN AFTA, like RCEP, even though you may have many countries, but mainly they are about merchandise trade.
Right.
But when you go into services, when you go into intellectual property right, when you go into government procurement, when you go into labor, human rights, and so on, it's become more difficult. And that's where the CPTPP is. Their coverage is much bigger than in terms of issue, in terms of subject matter, more than RCEP. That's why it's difficult to get people to join CPTPP. The reason because in Asia Pacific, economies are different. The stages of economic development are different. And therefore, when you go into services, like for example, we used to have a negotiation for FTA with the US. It broke down because of the inclusion of the US insistence on inclusion of intellectual property, inclusion of government procurement, and so on. That broke down. So that was the main reason, and explain why the difference between RCEP and CPTPP. So if you go into FTA, and if you do not include the too many sensitive issues on services, on non-merchandise, it's possible to go and have a FTA. Now on IPEF is basically to include India into this. I think as an economist, I welcome India, in trade and service in our region, because I see India really coming on very strongly. I see India coming in there, but the issue can be sensitive in terms of politics. The politics of regional cooperation. You see, when we have APEC, US was the big supporter of APEC all along. Until now, there is a suspicion in ASEAN, at least, that the US would like to introduce something else. And the reason because of US feeling about China. That's why IPEF. So the IPEF has some political smell or connotation in it, and making some of the ASEAN countries a little bit hesitant. Of course, we have already signed on, but when you go in further, it could be difficult. I think the best way forward would be to do this journey that Stephen talked about, the journey towards FTA, and along the way, and you could include India into that journey also. That'd be easier.
Thank you, Narongchai. It's a very interesting concluding point, actually, and makes a huge amount of sense and takes that element of political, I think, sensitivity is probably the best way to describe it out of the equation. Matt, these two acronyms must be cropping up regularly in your internal discussions. What's your take on, again, the direction of travel and the expectation of the impact of these two developments, RCEP and IPEF?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew, for the question. And, I think this comes back to a point that I believe it was Stephen who raised earlier, that, we don't want to get so excited about what happened last week and forget the fact that there are some very serious global economic challenges still out there that we're trying to really grapple with. And, Secretary Blinken said last week, we need to be able to all work together to really meet this moment that we're in, as we deal with a lot of these economic challenges and the aftermath of COVID and everything else. I think when you look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, launched earlier this year by the president during his visit to Tokyo, and then we had the first ministerial in Los Angeles. I think it's an attempt to really bring together a set of partners to try to come up with some new mechanisms to really drive forward on some of these priorities, again, to meet the moment that we're in. So if you look at the 4 pillars of IPEF, it's a lot of the things that other panelists have talked about today. It's about digital trade, it's about supply chains, it's about decarbonization, it's about anti-corruption, and trying to work with these 13 other partners, which importantly, I agree with Dr. Narongchai, having India there is very important. But I also will say something that I think Suzanne would completely agree with, is that it's very important to have Fiji there, and to have, the Pacific Islands representation as well. And so, I think that it's an attempt to have a new set of, mechanisms to work with different partners, but towards a lot of the same objectives. Because on those 4 pillars, if you think about what APEC has done for more than 3 decades, if you look at what some of the other, regional architectures are trying to do, a lot of it is working across these same objectives to really try to meet this moment that we're in. But I think, as our USTR Ambassador Tai would also point out, and I spent some time with her last week, the challenge for really all of us, and we keep coming back to this, is how do we make sure trade works for everyone, and it doesn't just work for, a small slice. I think this panel has been a terrific panel in the fact that you've got so many different stakeholders represented, right? You've got, Stephen talked about the importance of the private sector engagement, Dr. Narongchai from the academic side, and we have our APEC study centers that try to do some of that work, one of which is at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Suzanne talked about, engaging emerging leaders. Andrew talked about the great work Google is doing through things like the App Challenge and APEC, which I got to be a judge of in May. It was one of the highlights of my year. But also they had YouTube there last week to do a bunch of different interviews with content creators, which was really, I thought, a great way of trying to engage younger people. But unfortunately, we also have to think about who's not on this panel. We don't have workers on this panel. We don't have Indigenous people on this panel. We don't have, some of the poor and disenfranchised in my country or some of the other economies around the region on this panel. And so one of our, I think, really important roles as leaders in this area is we need to think about, how do we maximize our engagement there, and how can we use these instruments to make sure that happens. And so I think that's been the real focus of the administration here, the Biden-Harris administration, and really trying to develop, using both things that have been around for a while, like APEC, but also looking at what can we create that's new, like IPEF, in order to really get at solving some of these problems to make sure trade benefits everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Very well said about workers. And I remember a few years ago being in Davos, of all places, and attending a session on the future of labor, future of work and everything. And there's a lot of business people and CEOs discussing it, and not one labor organization. So point well made, Matt. And I think that's something we will look at and need to do. And again, it goes, how does one move away from inclusion being a slogan? This is what we want to do, into reality. And I think we've tended to focus very much on female rights, quite rightly, on next generation, the young. But I think the disenfranchised is very, very important, but also the general working part of society, very, very important. Thank you, Matt, for raising that. I appreciate that. So maybe I could just ask Stephen, Suzanne, and Andrew, just again for your reflections on how far you think RCEP can go, and IPEF next directions and reflections on that. Maybe Stephen, as you raised it in your session, maybe just some edited highlight from you.
Yes, perhaps I might just mention RCEP, since I'm actually a member of the RCEP Business Advisory Council
Fine.
as well.
That'd be great. Yes.
But I think RCEP has been very slow, to tell you the truth. The institutional mechanisms of RCEP have taken a long time to put in place. From a New Zealand's point of view, you know, that is the real gold in RCEP. It's trying to get the work done to address the issues. It's not just about cutting tariffs. In fact, RCEP doesn't deliver New Zealand very much in the way of new market access. We have FTAs with all the members anyway, but it does give an FTA of sorts between Japan, Korea, and China, which is pretty important. So we would like to see faster progress towards setting up those institutions, getting a secretariat established, and starting the work and making sure the business voice, and indeed the voice of other stakeholders, as we've been discussing, is included. Of course, India is not an RCEP. That's a bit of a theme of my current visit to India, actually. You know, I really wonder whether we missed an opportunity a long time ago to get India into APEC. The fact that India was not part of the habit of regional cooperation, rule making, getting together, you know, the whole APEC vibe, I think made it very difficult to engage with them in an RCEP negotiation. Interestingly, India has not joined the trade pillar of IPEF either, which is rather disappointing because, of course, it doesn't include market access. I must admit, and forgive me for this, Matt, I had a bit of a struggle with myself about IPEF. On the one hand, very much welcome US engagement in the region, realize why United States can't join CPTPP, really want to work with you all on all those things, but worried about this block idea, obviously China not included, you know, what about Latin America? I know you're doing a separate thing with them, but if you're thinking of an FTAAP context, we'd rather have everybody all together. But then I think to myself, well, the United States is not an RCEP either. And so neither are the Latin economies. And maybe you have to have various things that you take, that you move ahead to try to find solutions. So I guess my thought around IPEF now is, if there's good to find in it, we'll definitely find it. And New Zealand is really keen to work to find that. This is a legally binding instrument though, and which is welcome. It's not like APEC, although many of the things are the same as APEC. So it's legally binding. I think that's going to be a challenge in some of those areas, particularly areas like labor and the environment. I mean, how do you sanction a member that doesn't abide by the rules? And I think the last point to mention, though, the big areas of IPEF, I think, could well be in the trade facilitation space, getting goods and services, or goods in particular, moving faster around the region, and in the digital space. Some of the things that Andrew was talking about a moment ago, particularly on paperless trade. And Andrew was absolutely right when he pointed to the huge benefits that could accrue if we got rid of the paper and moved things more seamlessly and more quickly.
Thank you, Stephen. I think just to let everybody know, there is a separate session on India this afternoon, and I think these points are well made. And again, this recurring theme of, yes, what exactly is inclusion? How, actually, you know, Stephen, what really are the true stakeholders as well? And the stakeholder definition and concept is always changing. All we know is it's getting broader and deeper. That's for sure, absolutely for sure. And Suzanne, of course, RCEP, and in fact, these are, again, acronyms which you must be looking at very closely yourselves. What's the take at East West Centre on these two, the direction of travel?
Well, thanks for that. You know, I think what I hear from a lot of the convenings that we've had here, particularly in the Pacific, is, of course, market access. You know, it's wonderful to see the various groups wanting to create these regional bodies, economic bodies. But I think when we hear from the younger people, whether it's the young Southeast Asian leaders who just came through here, or Asian Pacific Leaders Program, many of them, of course, are fairness, inclusivity, indigenous knowledge, anti-corruption, clean energy, intellectual. What I invest in is important that it's protected, intellectual property rights, that what I am doing and the way in which I'm investing, that there is, climate mitigation factors that are included in that. And that's what the next generation of young leaders are looking at as they come through here. And those need to be considered in that. And for it to be successful, I think time will tell when people really have market access and when we message what the results are of both of these acronyms and bodies. So time will tell, but that's kind of what we're hearing from various programs that we have at the East-West Center.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And again, I think those points are very well made and very hard not to agree with them. I think we all sign up to those. And then just, Andrew, just again, reflections from a corporate perspective. RCEP and EPAC as a topic of conversation and a sense of policy direction. What's your take on this? How it's going so far and where it's heading in the future?
Sure. Well, maybe three quick points. I think, firstly, we're very supportive of all efforts that essentially advance that free, open, and secure internet that I mentioned at the beginning. For example, to ensure open data flows, to protect the IP of algorithms, and these are provisions which are contained in various of the agreements. RCEP obviously is a broader, sort of less deep agreement, but I think all efforts that move in that direction, I think, are important. It's interesting, actually, when you look at trade agreements on digital. I think historically, traditionally trade agreements are there. You have a barrier, and then brick by brick, you take it down in a free trade agreement. Digital almost started with zero barriers, and the barriers are coming into place. And it's more a question then of deciding what is the right arrangement and standards that you want to balance the different policy objectives that come up. So it's a slightly interesting way, I think, to think about trade agreements digital. It comes from a slightly different perspective. On IPEF, we're very supportive, and I think there's a great galvanizing impact that it can have as well. And we were to link the conversations, one of 14 companies early this year in LA to announce that as part of that, under those auspices, we would train 500,000 women in digital skills in this region over the next 10 years. So linking to the important point that Suzanne was making around women's economic empowerment. So I think there's a galvanizing force that some of these agreements and approaches and frameworks can have outside the formal black letter aspects of them as well. So that's important galvanizing impact as well.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew. Very interesting, that link back to the algorithms and intellectual property protection, which Suzanne was also talking about. Again, points very well made. Well, dear friends who've joined us today, we're reaching the end of the panel, and I really, what a fascinating conversation. And thank you, Michael, for inviting such esteemed speakers, and thank each and every one of you. If I could just go back to the beginning. New dimensions of connectivity in Asia Pacific. Positive, yes or no, about the development of connectivity and the future of connectivity in Asia Pacific? It's a one-word answer, and maybe I could just ask each in turn just to share your reflections. Dr. Narongchai?
Yes, positive, but not as big as I would like to see. Positive, yes.
Great.
After
So
this last week, positive.
yes, but with conditions attached, which is entirely reasonable. Matt?
Very optimistic, but we also have a lot of work to do.
That's right.
So very positive, but very realistic. Thank you, Matt. Stephen?
Positive, but could we go faster?
Ah, good. Positive yet impatient. Very good, Stephen. Thank you. Suzanne?
Positive. We just need to equip and develop our next generation of leaders.
Fantastic. Positive, yet stressing inclusivity. Fantastic. And Andrew?
And yeah, I'm only across the ditch from Stephen, so also optimistic. And I think that it's an approach that requires a multi-stakeholder approach to get there, given the scale of the challenges.
So yes, but have to be super collaborative and that broad stakeholder engagement. Well, look, Narongchai, Matt, Stephen, Suzanne, Andrew, thank you very, very much on behalf of Pacific Basin Economic Council for joining today. I think that was a fantastic conversation. There's a lot to take away. Big picture, I think, is we're very positive about connectivity in Asia Pacific. The Asia Pacific region is vitally important globally, as you actually mentioned, Andrew, at the beginning. It's easy to forget that. One of my day jobs globally, I run our asset management sector at KPMG, which is all of the big funds, the big sovereign wealth funds. You know, it's bigger than our banking sector, actually. It's massive. And always the discussions about Asia Pacific, and actually a recognition that the glide path over the next 5, 10, 25 years is towards Asia Pacific. And the absolute allocation of capital to Asia Pacific is still regarded as underweight. And when you look at the structural economic story in Asia Pacific, the international investment flows are still relatively underweight, given that proportion in the world. But of course, Asia Pacific is a great source of wealth and investment for outside the region. So this fundamental role of Asia Pacific as part of the world's capital story, I think, is something we also need to pull out as well. But we've also pulled out the importance of inclusion and the risk we run of defining that too narrowly and not having a paradigm which includes indigenous, young people, workers, those who may be left behind. And I think that's something we need to look at very, very carefully. But we also talked importantly about education, about human capital and social capital, which I think compared to a few years ago, we now realize has moved from being nice to have into being something absolutely fundamental for the success. And it's an enabler, but it's also a non-negotiable. And I think that's something we need to look at very closely as we pull together our white papers. And finally, but certainly not least, this concept of digitalization and technology transforming the landscape and the base at which we look at things is vitally important. And again, as you mentioned, Andrew, the advantage of a whole digitalization technical space is one starting with a blank sheet of paper. One starts with what one wants to achieve and how digitalization and technology can help get you there, rather than looking at what we have and applying technology to it. It's a very different way of thinking. So I think there's some great food for thought for the rest of the next few days. And as a plenary session to kick off the conference, I don't think we could have had a better one. So Narongchai, Matt, Stephen, Suzanne, Andrew, thank you very much. And I look forward to people joining our next session, which joins in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Guys, appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'll reach out to you individually. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.